More than 3 years ago, on the 29th of May 2023, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu stood before Nigerians and uttered just 5 words that would immediately change the country's economic direction. Fuel subsidy is gone. Within minutes, petrol prices surged, transportation fares climbed, businesses recalculated their costs, and millions of Nigerian families began adjusting to a completely new economic reality. It was one of the boldest policy decisions taken by any Nigerian president since the country's return to democracy. To supporters, it marked the beginning of long overdue economic reform. To critics, it marked the beginning of one of the most difficult periods in recent memory. 3 years later, the debate remains as intense as ever. Has President Tinubu truly placed Nigeria on the path to recovery? Or have ordinary Nigerians paid too high a price for reforms whose benefits remain largely invisible? Tonight, we look beyond politics, beyond campaign slogans, beyond social media arguments, and beyond partisan narratives. Instead, we'll examine the evidence, government claims, independent assessments, economic data, and perhaps most importantly, the lived experiences of everyday Nigerians. Because understanding President Tinubu's performance means accepting one uncomfortable reality. There are, in fact, 2 different Nigerias. 2 different pictures of one country. The first Nigeria is the one government officials often describe. A country where public revenues have increased, where foreign reserves have strengthened, where major highways are under construction, where student loan programs are expanding access to higher education, and where difficult reforms are gradually rebuilding the foundations of Africa's largest economy. Then, there is another Nigeria. The Nigeria experienced every morning in local markets, inside commercial buses, in neighborhood shops, across factories, and around countless family dining tables. This is the Nigeria where food prices continue to stretch household budgets, where transportation consumes a growing share of workers' incomes, where many small businesses struggle to survive, and where millions of families are still asking a simple question: when will life become easier? Neither picture is entirely wrong, and neither tells the complete story. Understanding Nigeria today requires looking at both realities at the same time. The Nigeria Tinubu inherited. Before judging any administration, it is important to understand where it started. When President Tinubu assumed office in May 2023, Nigeria was already facing deep structural economic problems that had developed over many years. One of the biggest was the fuel subsidy. For years, successive governments had acknowledged that subsidizing petrol consumed enormous public resources, money that could otherwise have been invested in roads, hospitals, schools, or other critical infrastructure. Yet, no administration had willingly or politically able to remove it. There was another challenge. Nigeria operated several foreign exchange markets at the same time. Different exchange rates created distortions, complicated business planning, discouraged investment, and placed sustained pressure on the country's foreign reserves. Meanwhile, government finances remained under increasing strain. Revenue struggled to keep pace with expenditure. Debt servicing consumed a significant share of public income, and international financial institutions repeatedly highlighted Nigeria's limited fiscal space and the need for broader revenue reforms. But these weren't the only problems. Inflation had already begun affecting households. Food prices were rising. Agricultural production was being disrupted in some regions by insecurity. Electricity shortages continued to affect businesses, and inadequate infrastructure limited economic productivity across the country. This was the economic landscape President Tinubu inherited. Supporters argue these long-standing structural weaknesses explain why difficult reforms became unavoidable. Critics, however, believe that while reforms may have been necessary, the speed and implementation of those policies intensified the hardship experienced by ordinary Nigerians. The gamble. Every presidency eventually faces defining moments. For President Tinubu, that moment came almost immediately. Rather than postponing difficult decisions, his administration chose to confront them head-on. It was a gamble, one built on a simple economic argument: accept short-term pain in exchange for long-term gain. The question was no longer whether reforms should happen. The question became, could Nigerians endure the cost before the benefits arrived? That question still defines much of today's national conversation. And it leads us directly to the reforms that would reshape Nigeria's economy. In the next part, we will examine the administration's biggest policy decisions, why supporters describe them as necessary, why critics remain unconvinced, and whether the evidence suggests those reforms are beginning to work. By the time President Tinubu had settled into office, it was clear his administration would not follow the cautious path taken by many before it. Instead, it chose speed. Within weeks, some of Nigeria's most sensitive economic policies were being rewritten. For supporters, these were long overdue decisions. For critics, they came with consequences that ordinary Nigerians will feel almost immediately. So, what exactly changed? And has it made Nigeria stronger? The reforms that changed the economy. The first, and by far the most controversial, was the removal of the petrol subsidy. For decades, governments had spent enormous sums keeping fuel prices artificially low. Officials argued that the system had become financially unsustainable. They said subsidy payments consumed trillions of naira each year, money that could instead be invested in roads, schools, hospitals, and other public services. But almost overnight, fuel prices rose sharply. Transportation became more expensive. Businesses faced higher operating costs. And because nearly every product in Nigeria depends on transportation, the effects quickly spread throughout the economy. Food became more expensive. Manufacturing costs increased and inflation intensified. The second major reform focused on Nigeria's foreign exchange system. For years, different exchange rates had existed side by side. Government officials argued this encouraged arbitrage, distorted the market, and discouraged investments. The Tinubu administration responded by allowing the naira to trade more freely under a unified foreign exchange market. The transition, however, was anything but painless. The naira depreciated significantly, imported goods became more expensive, manufacturers faced higher costs, and businesses that depended on foreign inputs suddenly found themselves operating in a much tougher environment. The administration also introduced tax reforms designed to strengthen government revenue, expanded access to student loans through the Nigerian Education Loan Fund, rolled out consumer credit programs, and pursued greater financial autonomy for local governments following a landmark Supreme Court judgment. Taken together, these policies represented one of the most ambitious reform programs seen in Nigeria in decades. The government's case. Ask government officials whether these reforms are working, and the answer is clear. Yes. They argue that although the decisions were difficult, the early results are beginning to appear. According to the administration, public finances have improved. Monthly allocations shared among federal, state, and local governments have increased significantly. Officials say this has given states greater financial capacity to execute development projects. Government reports also point to the stronger external reserves, moderate economic growth, hundreds of ongoing road projects, and the expansion of the NEL Fund Student Loan Program, which officials say has already supported more than 1 million students. There is also growing emphasis on compressed natural gas, or CNG, which the administration sees as a more affordable alternative to petrol for transportation. Supporters argue these are signs that Nigeria is gradually laying the foundation for a more sustainable economy. From this perspective, the hardship Nigerians are facing today is temporary. The benefits, they insist, will become more visible with time. But millions of Nigerians tell another story. Step away from official briefings, and another picture begins to emerge. For many Nigerians, life has simply become more expensive. The cost of food, transportation, electricity, housing, school expenses, nearly every aspect of daily living has become more difficult for households trying to keep up with the rising prices. Many workers say their salaries no longer stretch as far as they once did. Small businesses continue to struggle with rising operating costs. Manufacturers face expensive raw materials, and families increasingly adjust their spending just to meet basic needs. Even though the administration introduced a new national minimum wage and expanded several social support programs, many economists argue inflation has reduced much of their immediate impact. This, perhaps more than anything else, explains why opinions about President Tinubu remain so divided. Government statistics may point towards improving macroeconomic conditions, but millions of Nigerians continue to judge the economy by something much simpler. Can they afford today's market prices? Can they fuel their vehicles? Can they pay school fees? Can they grow their businesses? Those are the questions shaping public perception across the country. So, who is right? The government or the critics? The answer may not be as straightforward as many people imagine. Because in the final part, we will examine what independent experts have concluded, whether President Tinubu has delivered on his campaign promises, and ultimately whether history is likely to remember this administration as a turning point or a missed opportunity. So, how should President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's performance really be judged? Should it be measured by government statistics or by everyday experiences of ordinary Nigerians? Should success be defined by economic reforms or by whether families can actually feel the difference? These questions lie at the heart of one of Nigeria's biggest political debates, and perhaps the answer isn't as simple as choosing one side over the other. What independent experts say. Interestingly, independent analysts tend to avoid the political extremes. They neither describe the administration as an outright success, nor as an outright failure. Instead, many acknowledge that the Tinubu administration has undertaken some of the most significant structural economic reforms Nigeria has seen in decades, while also recognizing that those reforms have imposed substantial short-term costs on households. Independent analytical groups, including RTC Advisory, have broadly assessed the administration's performance within a range of approximately 55 to 65%. In other words, a mixed record. Progress in some areas, persistent challenges in others. International financial institutions have also generally supported the direction of reforms such as fuel subsidy removal, exchange rate liberalization, and efforts to strengthen public finances. But they have consistently emphasized something equally important. Economic reforms must be accompanied by effective social protection. Otherwise, the burden of reform falls most heavily on the country's most vulnerable citizens. That distinction may be the most important lesson of all. Good policy doesn't automatically guarantee better living standards. Implementation matters, execution matters, and ultimately, results matter. Has Tinubu delivered? When President Tinubu campaigned for office, he promised sweeping reforms. 3 years later, Some of those promises have clearly moved beyond words. Fuel subsidies were removed. The foreign exchange market was reformed. Tax reforms were introduced. The student loan program became operational, and local government financial autonomy advanced through a landmark Supreme Court judgment. Infrastructure projects continue across different parts of the country. Government revenues have increased, and new intervention programs have been introduced to support students, households, and small businesses. Yet, other promises remain works in progress. Security challenges persist. Many citizens continue to struggle with inflation and the rising cost of living. Questions remain about how effectively increased public revenues are translating into better public services. And for millions of Nigerians, the ultimate measure of success is still simple. Has life become better? That answer depends largely on who you ask. The years ahead. As Nigeria moves closer to another election cycle, the conversation is beginning to change. The debate is no longer simply about introducing reforms. Those reforms have already happened. Now, the focus shifts to outcomes. Will inflation continue to fall? Will food become more affordable? Will businesses expand and create jobs? Will electricity become more reliable? Will communities become safer? And perhaps most importantly, will ordinary Nigerians finally begin to experience the benefits that government says these reforms were designed to deliver? These questions will shape not only the country's economic future, but also its political future. The verdict. Perhaps the greatest mistake anyone can make is trying to reduce President Tinubu's administration to a simple headline, because the evidence tells a far more complicated story. This has been an administration willing to make bold decisions that previous governments often avoided. It has pursued structural reforms, expanded student financing, reported improvements in public finances, and invested in infrastructure. At the same time, millions of Nigerians continue to face genuine economic hardship. Inflation has stretched household budgets. Small businesses remain under pressure. Security concerns continue in parts of the country, and many families are still waiting to experience the improvements promised by these reforms. Both realities exist, and both deserve to be acknowledged. History has a way of judging leaders differently from the headlines of the moment. Some reforms are appreciated only years after they are introduced. Others never achieve the outcomes their architects intended. Whether President Tinubu's reforms ultimately transform Nigeria or become remembered as a period of prolonged sacrifice will depend not on speeches, not on political campaigns, and not on economic projections alone. It will depend on whether ordinary Nigerians begin to see measurable improvements in their everyday lives. Can families afford food with less anxiety? Can young graduates find meaningful employment? Can businesses grow with confidence? Can farmers cultivate their lands safely? Can communities live without fear? Those questions, more than any government report, will define the legacy of this administration. For now, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's record remains a story of ambition, difficult choices, measurable policy achievements, and continuing public hardship. It is perhaps a story that is still being written. If you found this analysis informative, share your thoughts in the comments. What has been the biggest change you've personally experienced since 2023? Has Nigeria moved in the right direction? Or is there still a long road ahead? If you value balance, evidence-based journalism that goes beyond headlines and political talking points, subscribe to DSG Herald News for more in-depth documentaries, explainers, and analysis on Nigeria, Africa, and the world. I am Grace AK. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and keep seeking the facts.